I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the Battlefront, analyse Saturday evening's deadly bomb attack on the outskirts of Moscow, and we welcome former Nato battalion commander Hamish de Bretton-Gordon to talk about the ongoing risks to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 22nd of August, day 180. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor, Francis Durnley, and the former commander of NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN, that's Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Battalion, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started off by asking Dom for the latest news from the war zone.
Hi David, hi everybody, hi Hamish, great to have you back. It's busy weekend, lots going on. I'll try and take a skip through the news, won't dwell too much because there's a lot going on, but basically there was a drone strike on Saturday on the Sevastopol headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. Now it didn't seem to do much. It damaged the building a bit, but there's lots of footage on social media of the drone and of Russians firing into the air. This is a daylight attack. Lots of people filming it. Interesting that I'll come back to that. Do it in daylight so that people film it and put it out on social media channels. Separately, there was a Russian soldier in Melitopol was killed by partisans. There's various reports he was attacking a woman or a child and was himself assaulted and killed. The Centre for National Resistance, which was established by the Ukrainian government to coordinate and support partisan activities, said on their website that they took responsibility for that and said that other Russian occupiers would meet similar fate. And also there was another strike, suspected Ukrainian strike, on an arms storage site in forgive the pronunciation please, Chornobyka, which is just on the northwest edge of Kherson city itself, so right down in the Kherson front. And there were self-propelled guns, tanks, armoured fighting vehicles destroyed in that attack, and there were reports of dozens of Russian casualties as well. Now I say those three things quickly, not to rattle through the news, but just to say that this, I think, is adding to a climate of fear in Russian forces and possibly also Russian society. The more these things are filmed, the more these things are able to be filmed and are then posted on Russian social media channels, the more it adds to this climate of fear. We're going to talk about the assassination of Daria Dugina in a minute. Francis will lead on that. But I just want to hold in the back of your thoughts, back of your minds that this momentum, some of these attacks, okay, the attack on the weapons storage site sounds pretty big. But the other attacks are very, very small. And in the middle of a war, we wouldn't ordinarily talk about the killing of one particular soldier. But I think the fact that it was partisan activity and they've been very open about claiming responsibility for that, I think is quite interesting. And it just adds, I think, to this momentum, Ukraine's momentum. Firstly, it shows momentum, and it shows that they are able to conduct these strikes by day and night across the whole spectrum of conflict and geography. So it's interesting what I think Ukraine is aiming to do here to give this idea that Russia just can't deal with this. And as I say, we'll talk about the assassination in a minute, but whatever that turns out to be, could add to this. I think we should note it's been very violent from the Russian side. There've been a lot of strikes in the east around the Donbass and in the south, and in particular there's been a lot of firing near the nuclear power plants at Zaporizhzhia, and Hamish is going to tell us a little bit more about that in a minute, and also the South Ukraine nuclear power plant Vonozhensk, again apologies for the pronunciation, which is just northwest of Mykolaiv. So again, these civil nuclear facilities that are now increasingly, if not directly targeted, and we can have a discussion about that, but certainly coming under fire. But more from that, I'm sure, on Hamish, and more from the assassination in a minute.
Thanks, Dom. Francis, I know you had a few comments just to add to Dom's roundup there.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to echo, first of all, what Don was saying there about the ramping up and escalation in tensions over recent days. It's been, I think, very noteworthy indeed, seeing just quite how much has happened over the weekend. It just goes to show that just when you think things have reached a sort of a certain level, suddenly things can very much flare up again. And that's indeed what we've seen in the past couple of days or so. I just wanted to pick on one other element of the military side of things, taking perhaps a little bit more of a longer term perspective, more broad brush approach based on the comments of Mike Hertling, who's the former commanding general of the US Army Europe, who's made some interesting remarks on Twitter in the past 24 hours or so. And he, in this, in quite a long thread, just details basically what's happened in the war so far and where we're at as far as he's concerned, looking at this as a military analyst, strategist, etc. And his comments, I think, on the Ukrainian situation are very interesting. Essentially, he says that Ukraine has shown that whilst it's relatively well trained, well led, and has high morale and has considerable support from their government, it's still obviously the challenge that they are facing in the longer term is going to be launching large-scale operations, and clearly, as we're seeing, that they are not yet capable of doing that. We've talked so much about the counter-attack that's been expected around Kherson and in the south, and whilst we've seen incremental stages towards that, we have not yet seen that large-scale operation that some were predicting. However, and he goes on and says that whilst they're not able to do it yet, that in the longer term, he expects that they will be able to, that they are better at adapting, that they're still training, they're incorporating new equipment, which of course is still arriving from the West every day. And at the moment, he thinks what's going on is they are prepping the battlefield, his words, conducting limited counterattacks and guerrilla operations that contribute to the early stages of a counteroffensive, because that's essentially what they're capable of doing at the present moment. But that will change soon, implying that they will have the capacity to launch large scale operations, but it will take time. My only observation coming off the back of that, of course, is that does Ukraine have that time? As we were talking about last week, when you look at the increasing pressures in the West of the consequences of this war, particularly on energy prices, we just seen a breaking story today that energy costs are now going up 16% across Europe, and of course that's expected to rise. There will, of course, inevitably be increasing pressure on Ukraine to show that they have the long-term strategy, the long-term success in mind here, that will enable the West to continue supporting them, thinking that there's a long-term opportunities for success. So I just wanted to make that point. There's some very interesting remarks by Mike Hertling, but does Ukraine have the time? Let's hope so, but I think that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Francis. We will talk about the car bomb attack in Moscow later. I'd just like to bring in Hamish de Bretton-Gordon at this point. So I know, Hamish, you do have to go by past. We've spoken about some of these attacks near nuclear plants. Can you update us on the situation and just tell us how your latest thoughts on what's happening?
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Yet again, over the weekend, very much the nuclear power stations in the news. I suppose the positive thing that came out at the end of last week was that Putin, in discussions with Macron, has agreed that there should be international inspectors allowed into Zaporizhzhia. Unfortunately, there's no time zone or time given to that. One assumes it'll be the International Atomic Energy Agency who would go there. Now, this would be a very positive step. I in the past, and we discussed last week of, actually Zaporizhzhia is almost developing as a sort of improvised nuclear device. And when you hear about the momentum appearing to swing in the Ukraine direction, then these sort of unconventional type potential weapons become, even more concerning. We've heard over the weekend as well that there'd be more strikes, missile strikes, artillery in the vicinity of Zaporizhzhia, and only today, and also extended further. I think the other things to consider, of course, the Russians are talking about turning off Zaporizhzhia, which provides, in good times, about 20% of the power to Ukraine. But turning off a nuclear power station, is not an inconsiderable activity. that would take days and weeks of planning. And if it's not done properly, can create real problems. A lot of people have been discussing where the issue with cooling of spent fuel rods, if the power to that goes, then one could have a problem there. I would also like to state that there is a lot of talk about these bombs and rockets creating some sort of nuclear meltdown and explosion. This is highly unlikely. These reactors are incredibly strongly built with concrete covers over them, so it would be unlikely that would cause a problem. However, we've also heard that the Russian General Vasilyev, who understands also a senior GRU officer, who seems to be in control of the area, has claimed in various areas that the reactors have been wired with explosives to explode. If that did happen, then that would create a huge potential problem. So we haven't really got much further on this particular side. We don't know when those inspectors are in. Ideally, they should be in sort of next week, but I don't suppose that's going to happen. The only other thing, and I'm sure you're going to discuss it later, with Ukraine Independence Day on Wednesday and lots of talk about spectaculars, one absolutely hopes that Zaporizhzhia isn't part of this, but again, it does raise the tempo. And I think going back to one of the original points, as the tide moves against the Russians and their conventional warfare, which you have discussed so articulately earlier on and before, appears to be stumbling, then the unconventional asymmetric no doubt will become more of a view that the Russians might start to do that, because I personally think, and I think a lot of people do, that Putin absolutely can't afford to fail in Ukraine, otherwise he's gone. Over.
Hamish, may I jump in quickly, ask a question? Grain. Now, why did Putin allow the grain to get out? There's some suggestion that actually it's all part of a master plan, that he wants the ships gone so he can start bunging missiles in there with very little risk of an international blowback by hitting international shipping. Or he was forced to diplomatically to have to do that. He just had nowhere else to go. The issue became too much on the international agenda. Is the nuclear issue in that similar league, i.e., is there so much pressure now for the IAEA to go in that Putin has to allow something, or does he have wiggle room, or am I looking at it completely wrong? He just doesn't feel the pressure, or if he feels the pressure, he just ignores it because there's too much of an operational bonus to him, operational benefit by holding and threatening and holding at risk these nuclear power plants.
Dom, I absolutely agree with you. I think that's the case. In these strategic maneuvers and movements, it would appear that Putin doesn't hold a lot of ace cards at the moment. The grain that is beginning to trickle out now, but it's very slowly, and it gives him leverage over the West. And absolutely, I think nuclear power is in that entirely. We've heard all about the false flag, the false flag chemical and biological attacks at the early part of the war, which very happily have sort of dissipated now. But exactly the same with nuclear. That is the one thing that is, I think, holding the world at arm's length. You speak to anybody in this country, I speak to a lot of people over the weekend who are really, really scared about the nuclear piece. On the one hand, people say, are we scaremongering, talking about it? On the other hand, if we don't talk about it and put in mitigation to make sure that if there is some accident and disaster, it doesn't affect us as badly as it could do, then you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. But absolutely, I think this is key to Putin's plans. And I've talked about the unconventional type warfare, which I saw a lot of in Syria. In that particular case, sort of blowing up chemical factories to create a hazard, and we've already seen that in Ukraine on a number of occasions. And that was with my time with the Peshmerga fighting ISIS back in 2015 and 17. They blew up chemical factories and plants, most famously Al-Mishraq, south of Mosul, which had a strategic effect on operations. Without going into too much detail, it sort of derailed the Iraqi army for a few weeks. So these unconventional methods, really have a psychological impact as well as potentially a tactical. And with the whole chem, bio, and nuclear thing, the psychological is 10 to 1 the physical. And somebody like Putin is, with his background in the GRU and FSB, he understands better the sort of strategic mind games, I expect, the most. And nuclear for him, I expect, is his gold card. And that's why we have to approach it with such seriousness, not try and terrify everybody out of their seats in this country and elsewhere, but just make sure that this is something we need to resolve as an international community. Because if there is an accident, deliberate or whatever, with Zaporizhzhia, I personally believe that could bring NATO directly into this war rather than indirectly.
Great, thank you. Terrifying, but thank you. And just finally, so the IAEA, can you give us a quick skit on that, please? How big is it? What teeth does it have? Can it actually do anything here?
Well, Dom, in normal times, it is the world's agency for ensuring nuclear security. And the IAEA could go to any nuclear site around the world. This is the power stations. We're not talking about nuclear weapons here, and ensure that they're safety. So all the nuclear power stations in the UK will be inspected on a regular basis and advice given on how to make sure that they're safe. And, with the members of the International Atomic Agency, which is all the nuclear producers in the world, including Russia, they should, in theory, have free rein to go anywhere they like to ensure safety. And that happens pretty much all over the place. But of course, in a war zone, that is slightly different. And I don't think any of us really envisaged that nuclear power stations would be fought over, because apart from the IAEA, also the Geneva Convention and the rules of war protects nuclear power stations. But we've seen with the Russian troops now stationed around Zaporizhzhia and the fighting going on there, they have complete disregard for that. So in theory, the International Atomic Energy Agency should be able to get in there and should be able to do a complete safety check. If there is anything malign or malicious there, one would expect to see the Russians sort of cleaning it up and sorting it out in the next few weeks. But they will know well that every satellite available to the West will be absolutely peering down on Zaporizhzhia to see what's happening. So if they do get in there in the next few weeks, that is a really good thing, because they will be able to have a deep look. And in theory, they should be able to go there whenever they like. But, I might be super cynical, but, Putin is not necessarily always good to his word.
Hamish, just a question from me. From your experience leading NATO's CBRN battalion, what kind of things do you think the Ukrainian armed forces and civilians should be doing in the light of this risk? I mean, what kind of tactics, or thinking more long term, what kind of action should they be taking?
Well, that's a really good question, and the Ukrainian people are very, very concerned about this and about the whole CBRN piece. These people who are steeped in the old Soviet Union, where chemical, biological, and nuclear was a key part of the weaponry of these places. A lot of people who've grown up about it and know about it, and actually, I've published the last chapter in my own memoir, which is about surviving chemical, biological, and nuclear attacks in Ukraine, and a lot of people have that. We've also made an app on what to do in the event of some sort of disaster like this. And again, without wanting to scaremonger, there is an awful lot you can do. The sort of fallout that you would get if there is a fire or an accident at Zaporizhzhia, we sort of know where it will go. And the meteorological agency from Ukraine issued that, I think, maybe late last week or over the weekend, showing where the radiation is likely to go. And at the moment, it's all likely to go west, which, I've heard some people say, well, the Russians would never create an accident here because it would go to Russia. Well, on the current climate at the moment and for the next few days or weeks, it's all going west. Now, they can get out of the way of that. And actually, in the immediate aftermath, you sort of get under cover because, radiation will stick to things and all the rest of it. So there is an awful lot that you can do to prepare yourself, and hopefully people have a rough idea, not only because of their background, but there are other people like me who are trying to make sure that people have an idea of what they can do to survive. I mean, it's a bit like soldiers and bombs and bullets. You know how you can sort of survive in this context. There are a few people with my background because thankfully CBRN has something that is little used for many, many years, but we're trying to get the message out across as we did in Syria. And so people have a rough idea, but the main thing is to, make sure that these accidents, disasters, or deliberate use of CBRN just doesn't happen. And as Dom highlighted earlier, this is a potential gold card that Putin has to wave, and it's very important the international community, which I might say, apart from a few leaders, I think have been pretty quiet over the last few weeks. Let's hope they're all back from their holidays now and absolutely focus on this, get us past Independence Day on Wednesday, and then hopefully get those inspectors in so we can ramp down the threat of any dreadful nuclear accident or deliberate use of nuclear power stations as some sort of improvised weapon.
Thanks, Hamish. I think Francis had a question as well.
Yes, hi Hamish. Fascinating to hear your perspective on this. I've got a sort of question and then a comment, really. My first question is, if you were in charge, if you were advising, say, the British government now or government in Ukraine, would you be saying and calling for a return to the kind of advice that was being given to citizens during the Cold War about what to do if there is a nuclear incident of some kind?
Again, that's a really good question. And I wrote about it in the Telegraph, I think about a week ago, that perhaps we need to dust off our measures for potential nuclear accident or attack, which, quite rightly, since the end of the Cold War, we have really put all our defensive and protective measures to bed because, the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons was going very well. And there was, the threat was rescinding. And it's just that Ukraine has obviously changed all that. The Russians have threatened the use of strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. But, I'm hopefully fairly confident that our own nuclear weapons would prevent that happening. But it's the accident thing that is a concern. And if you're old enough, probably none of you are old enough to remember the Cold War, when we used to have sort of black and white BBC films every now and again, just sort of reminding you what to do in the event of an attack and just giving you some sort of idea. I think it's a very fine sort of line between getting people really terrified or reassuring them. The only thing, back in the Cold War days, I think our parents and grandparents were reassured rather than terrified. So I think it is worth dusting off. And of course, if that Zaporizhzhia there is an accident and there is mass contamination, it could be a lot worse than Chernobyl. And we sort of know that some of it is going to come our way. And although, there are agencies in this country who, really understand what to do, it might be worth just reminding the public what to do. But again, I accept that it is a fine balance between scaremongering and reassurance.
And just a couple of observations based on what you were saying, Hamish. I mean, the first thing I think to just comment is that this horrendous crisis is all a consequence of Putin's actions in Ukraine. I mean, the very fact that we're having this conversation shows how far things have escalated since February, and just quite how serious what has happened continues to be. Just one other observation I had picking up what you were saying. clearly nuclear, whether in energy form or as a weapon, is, as you say, Putin's gold card. And it seems to me that the central question now that the West has to be asking itself, and should have been asking itself from the beginning if it hasn't been, is how do we neutralise that? On the one hand, on the energy, of course, we've talked about the EU manoeuvres to try and wean itself off Russian energy, which is mostly gas, but still this is part of this energy question. But not only that, on the weaponry side of things, I've spoken on the podcast in the past that it seems to me that the very fact that there is this sort of nuclear threat of escalation is basically what stopped the West intervening in Ukraine in terms of direct military action. It's what stopped the no-fly zone not taking place. It's what stopped there being tanks sent in or soldiers, which I think they would have been were it not for that threat of there being nuclear weapons used. And as I say, I think that we've basically just accepted that narrative that, oh, well, there's nothing you can do. He's got these weapons and that's that. But I feel still that there are conversations to be had that could make that threat neutralised or at least greatly reduced if it is made much more clear to Russia what it would mean if any kind of weapon were utilised. I mean, you could be talking already about, as I've spoken in the past, you could be saying what exactly what would happen in the eventuality of such a weapon being used, that all of Europe would immediately cease any purchasing of Russian energy, for instance. You could have some sort of arrangement with other powers around the world that they would immediately cease trading or doing any deals with Russia whatsoever. I mean, it is not in the world's interest for us to be having conversations like this right now, and yet it seems that we are having these conversations as a direct consequence of Putin's callousness and where we are at this present moment in the war. So, as I say, less of a question, but more of an observation based on what you're saying. But perhaps you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I do, and I absolutely agree with you. Unfortunately, we could discuss this today, but I've just been writing a piece on this sort of issue, and it's slightly. Yesterday was the 9th year anniversary of the massive sarin attack in Ghouta in Syria, and when Obama's red line disappeared. And basically, we didn't do very much. Now, I think wind forward 9 years, that has emboldened people like Putin because, we had said back then, if you use chemical weapons, that will go beyond the pale and we will absolutely hammer you. Now, nothing happened then. And I think, Putin didn't expect the West to do an awful lot when he invaded Ukraine back in February. So all the time, up until February, we've been sending the wrong messages. And I agree with you entirely. Putin needs to be absolutely certain that if he uses, even his smallest nuclear weapon, he will get it back in spades from the West, because it is a nuclear war is absolutely in nobody's interest at all, and one gets the feeling still that the Russians are not entirely convinced that the West has the stomach for this, or the stomach for completely. Cutting Russia off, as you said. And I hope that with our Western leaders and leaders around the world now coming back on the stage, as it were, that they make that absolutely clear to Russia and to Putin, and probably more importantly, those around him, because, one feels there must be some checks and balances within Russia to make sure that, Putin doesn't have a rush of blood and head for the red button, which I think there are. I mean, lots of people are worried that he might, wake up one night and press the red button. That just would not happen and cannot happen, as it couldn't happen anywhere around the world. But we are where we are, I think, because of our lack of activity in Syria over the last 9 years, and we need to regain ourselves. And it's really a chance. NATO has got to provide that direction and leadership, and we in the UK, which I'm absolutely, from my sort of work with people in Ukraine, they are so thankful with the efforts that we put towards Ukraine and supplying them with weaponry and intelligence and all the rest of it. But we must really stand firm now, because the cost of living crisis, global warming, et cetera, if things go badly wrong in Ukraine, and we do get into a nuclear conflict, all those other issues that will become horrifically irrelevant.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Hamish, we realise you have to go now. Is there anything you haven't mentioned that you think is worth talking about?
Well, I know that people get terrified by the whole sort of CBRN nuclear debate. And some people say, well, you shouldn't talk about it, stick your head in the sand and it won't happen. I just, really my last point that, this is such an important thing that we must all absolutely focus on it to get it right. But also, for the people in Ukraine, it is, if there is a big accident at Zaporizhzhia or Russia decides to use chemical or biological weapons, there are things you can do. It is the threat that you ignore or you don't recognise that is the one that is really going to trip you up. So I think we're in a position now where we must make sure that people have everything they can to survive, and we must make sure our world leaders absolutely get on this and make sure that Putin understands the consequences of his potential actions in this area.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, for joining us this week. Thank you for all of your thoughts. Are hugely welcome. There are other updates we haven't spoken about. Over the weekend, there was a car bomb attack in Moscow, killed a prominent pro-war ideologue. Francis, can you talk to this? What happened and what's the latest on that?
Yes, well, this is a really big story for many reasons. First of all, I think the headline is, yes, there was this car bomb attack in Moscow, which has killed the daughter of a very prominent nationalist ideologue in Russia called Alexander Dugin. I'll talk a little bit about him in a moment, though it's worth saying that his daughter is also a very prominent advocate for the war in Ukraine. She's a journalist that's under sanctions in the West and has been a cheerleader for what's been going on in recent months. She's been described as a frequent and high-profile contributor of disinformation in relation to Ukraine and the Russian invasion. But the significance of this, of course, is the initial escalationary impact in terms of this is something that has occurred in relation to the war on Russian soil and very close to the centre of power in Moscow, not only in Moscow, but actually geographically within Moscow. It's where a lot of prominent Russian politicians live. So this will inevitably cause concern from their perspective. Who is Dugin, whose daughter has died? Well, as I say, he's a very prominent commentator as far as Western observers are concerned, although less so, I think it's important to be said, in Russia itself. He published a book in 1997 called The Foundations of Geopolitics, which effectively outlined his worldview, which is calls for Russia to rebuild its influences through conquest, essentially, and challenging the United States empire, of which he sees sort of Western Europe as being a part. But he's written on all sorts of subjects, whether it be philosophical or political theory. And as I say, whilst he's been known in Russia, he is clearly a figure that is talked about. He is not this huge I mean, there's been remarks made in the last 24 hours that he's Putin's Rasputin, or that he's Putin's sort of chief philosopher. I don't think either of those things are true. And reading analysis by many commentators, including a piece by Mark Galalotti in The Spectator over the weekend, that just underlines the fact that he isn't this great influential powerhouse within the Russian state. That actually he's somebody who's very much on the outlier and indeed has really been frozen out by the Kremlin for some time. But nonetheless, I think we can predict certain outcomes that are likely to come as a consequence of this, regardless of who is responsible. It's important to say, I think, that in the last sort of 20 minutes or so, the Russian FSB, their intelligence services, have officially accused Ukraine's spy network as being responsible for the attack. Ukraine has already denied involvement, saying that, quote, "we are not a criminal state like the Russian Federation." So we don't actually know who is responsible for this. Some are, as I say, are blaming Kyiv. Most likely, Russia will continue to do so. Some are saying that it was actually a Kremlin hit designed to lay the foundations for further aggression in Ukraine. There's some commentators are saying it actually has nothing really to do with the war at all. That it may well be internal divisions within the Russian state, something like contract killing to do with politics and business disputes rather than anything sort of bigger than that. So there's lots of things. But as I say, the real thing we can talk about is what the likely outcomes are of this. And I think it's fair to say that it will lead almost certainly or be utilised by the Russian state as a justification for whatever actions they do in Ukraine in the coming days and weeks, saying that this is, as I say, an example of how the war is now a direct threat to elements of the Russian state, and it could be used by Putin to justify all sorts of things, whether that be the use of certain weapons in Ukraine, perhaps further clampdowns within the Russian state itself, of potential opponents, arrests and things like that. Of course, it could also be used as a justification for the trials that we're expecting to see in the coming days, worryingly, of Ukrainians. There's been really shocking images both in Ukraine and elsewhere of cages being erected that are potentially being used to for sort of show trials of Ukrainians. And this is all prior, of course, to, as Dom mentioned, Independence Day, which is coming up imminently. And this, as I say, may well lay the groundwork for certain Russian actions, which otherwise may not have been as easily justifiable. Justifiable, I should say, in inverted commas. As they would have been had this attack not taken place. And I think I'll leave the last remark on this to Galalotti, who says that a dead Dugin would have been a malleable martyr. An angry living one could prove a wild card. And I think that's also worth saying here, is that what we don't know, of course, is that whether his daughter was the intended target or whether it was Dugin himself. If it was the latter and he has survived, then of course there will be unexpected consequences of that when you've got a very incendiary figure like him who will now be in the spotlight in Russia, saying all sorts of remarks that no doubt will be being able to use by propagandists and the like. That may well have consequences both for the Kremlin but also for the West that are as yet unpredictable. But I've got more things I can talk about on this, but no doubt Don will have some thoughts as well.
Thanks, Francis. All I'd add is that this is very interesting if, as you say, in the last 20 minutes, the FSB have come out to blame Ukrainian spies. I mean, to acknowledge that or to push that line, to say that Ukraine have been able to penetrate right into, I mean, this wasn't in Moscow, this was just to the west of Moscow, but I mean, right inside the Russian state, to admit that they've got that close and carried out this attack and got away with it. I mean, in the Mark Galeotti article, he says that in the next day or so, we'll probably have some wonderfully staged footage of a house raid somewhere in Russia, and there'll be a bomb-making factory, etc., etc. But what they've admitted, if they are saying that this was a Ukrainian attack, is that they got through again. And just as we saw in Saki, and actually over the last couple of weeks, these attacks in Crimea, that show up a failure of Russian air defence or show up a failure of the Russian system somehow, whatever caused those attacks, we still don't know. But these are all admissions that something's got through. Something's got through the layers. Now, something always gets through. Okay, this is war. There's going to be attacks on either side. But this attack, this assassination, whether it was for her or for the father or what have you, and whatever the message is, but to do this so close to the very seat of power in Russia, and to get away with it, unless and until we see some unfortunates be grabbed by the FSB, then I think this is absolutely extraordinary. I'm not going to add to the speculation about who or what it could have been, because I simply don't know, and I'll just be adding there's going to be a time for that, and it's not now, because we just need to introduce the news and talk about what we do know, and so I just think this is a very dangerous game that Russia are playing with, unless it was Ukraine, in which case a very dangerous game they're playing with. But I think, as I mentioned at the start, this growing sense of vulnerability from Russia. If there are attacks now in Crimea all over Russian social media, there's this attack that will be all over social media and the normal media, the dreaded mainstream media. So, well, I suppose it is dreaded mainstream media in Russia. But anyway, I move on. I think this could really backfire on Russia. If they blame Ukraine, then they are admitting that they've had Ukrainian agents operating freely inside Russia, and I think that is an extraordinary, whether it's true or not, an extraordinary statement to come out with.
I think that's absolutely true. Although, on the other hand, as I say, it can be used as an ideological weapon by the regime, even if the Ukrainians weren't responsible. By this happening in and of itself can be a useful political tool for what we may see next. But just to echo what you were saying there, actually, Mark Galalotti is going to write for us today, and looking through the notes of what he's going to write. So I think he's writing it as we speak. He's going to talk about, to Dom's point, that these are attacks. Whoever is responsible, they are playing into this sort of psychological warfare phase of which we are now seeing, not only within Russia, but also within Crimea as well, as the attacks we were talking about last week. These are attacks on sort of Russia's heart, one could say, and what happens next is unpredictable as a consequence of that. And I think, just talking about Crimea specifically, I made this point last week, but I think it is worth underlining, which is that from the perspective of many Russians, Crimea is part of their territory now. It has been annexed since 2015 and is differently treated to the rest of Ukraine. I'm not justifying that. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm just saying that is a fact. And indeed, it's important to say that even Russian dissidents like Navalny see Crimea as part of Russia. And so these attacks that we've been seeing, particularly in Crimea, I would argue are even more significant because it's a clear statement of intent by the Ukrainians to say that, no, we do not recognize this, that this is part of our territory. And it's hugely damaging for Putin too, because he'd claimed that he'd made a fortress out of Crimea. He'd actually used that word. And yet, to Dom's point, if you're then facing the kind of attacks you're seeing, it's clearly that has failed for the world to see. And so there are huge risks inherent in that. And I think, as I say, the war is entering now a different phase, one that is more psychological, one that is now showing statements of intent through these kind of actions, as the war is sort of in the big grand strategy has sort of ground somewhat to a halt. But the problem with that, of course, is that there are unintended consequences of this, that we are in uncharted territory that is less predictable, as we've just seen from the actions over the weekend. And who knows what may be a result of that.
Just very quickly, it's quite sobering to realise, we're talking about, and we've seen a lot in the last few days, of Russian public reaction to attacks now in Moscow and, of course, in Crimea over the past few weeks. And let's not forget, of course, I've just got a notification on my phone from our time there, Dom. The air raid sirens have just been sounded in Kyiv a minute ago. So people are being asked to move to the shelters. And that's something that the Ukrainian public have lived with for almost 6 months now. Sorry, Dom, I know you had a thought you wanted to just come in on.
Well, I was just going to finish my bit by adding to Francis's point there about how the war is moving into a psychological. Well, it's always in a psychological area as well. That's always there. But as the movement on the front line, if you like, I don't particularly like the expression, but it's easy shorthand now. It works. As that movement sort of calcifies, not stand fast, whatever may or may not be about to happen in the Kherson region. But as the war calcifies, then these other unconventional methods come to the fore. Firstly, to keep momentum up, to keep morale up, to keep the stay on the front foot, to push the enemy back, etc., etc. And maybe what we're seeing here from Ukraine over the last few weeks with these unconventional attacks, drone strikes, whatever they are, missiles, special forces, partisans, yada yada, whatever they are, is what you can do when you are exhausted and you've culminated in the heavy metal game. Russia, I think, is also in that position. They're exhausted and have culminated in the heavy metal game, but they have shown themselves to be much more one-dimensional in their thinking. So should we expect some clever, unconventional tactics, unconventional attacks from Russia? Probably not. What do? They go up Route 1. It's fairly straightforward. It's clunky. And what have they got? The Zaporizhia nuclear plant. So I don't want to. As Hamish was saying earlier on, we are not trying to overblow this, and we're not trying to scare people. We're trying to have sensible, considered debate around these issues. But if we are moving into this phase of less heavy metal, more unconventional tactics, I haven't seen anything to suggest that Russia is particularly nuanced and nimble of mind to adopt unconventional tactics. I think they're fairly clunky, and I just worry about what they could consider doing with Zaporizhia.
Francis, there's one update about German gas. Can you just cover that for us? Keep us up to date there.
Sure, yes, just very briefly. Germany has a good chance of getting through this winter due to the drastic measures that it's taken. That's according to its economy minister, Robert Habeck. And I just wanted to comment on that, which is, as we were talking about briefly a few days ago, Germany has managed to cut back quite considerably on its use of gas. I think it's around 13-14%. So no mean feat in a short period of time. Of course, there are huge economic consequences of that. But nonetheless, I think that it's to Germany's credit that they have been able to do something to respond to the enormity of the challenge that's been faced. And as I say, this is the great problem of the present moment, is that we're not in winter yet, but when we are there, this will be the real test of Western resolve. They're saying that in Germany, inflation could reach a 70-year high. As I've already mentioned, energy prices are up 16%. Here in Britain, inflation is up, as of this morning, 18%, or is predicted to go that high. I mean, these are astronomically high numbers. And I am yet to see a response from Western governments that is really matching the severity of that. And of course, the disaster would be that Britain and other countries are ill prepared just quite for the scale of the catastrophe that this could cause for people, and that could undermine resolve for what could be a long and harmful winter. But as I say, I don't want to sort of go too much into detail because that's a whole broader question, but I think it is, as I say, the central question of the moment, to put it bluntly.
Thank you very much for that, Francis. As I said, I think we're coming to the end of our time together. Dom Nichols, can I get your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just struck by President Zelensky last night in his nightly address said that in advance of Wednesday's Independence Day being marked in Ukraine, 31 years since Ukraine split from the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine was independent, he warned of, quote, something particularly ugly coming from Russia. Now, he uses his words very wisely. He uses them to galvanize support. He knows that words have power, but he hasn't so far been known to use hyperbole and loose language. So I'm particularly worried by that. I think this is going to be a bit of a tough week, to be perfectly honest, because it's not going well for Russia. There's been an extreme provocation here by groups unknown, and blame being pointed all over the place. We've got the Zaporizhzhia stuff that we've talked about, and these comments from President Zelensky about something particularly ugly coming from Russia, I think gives us pause for concern. Not trying to overdo it, not trying to scaremonger and do the sort of headline grabby stuff. But yeah, I think this week deserves, if we can anymore, keep our eye on the news. History is going to come out as fast this week, I think.
And Francis Durnley, would you like the final thoughts?
Sure. Sorry to interrupt you, David. Yes, I just wanted to completely echo what Dom was saying there. I think that this suddenly feels like a very significant week indeed. But for my final thought, there's been another interesting piece published by the Washington Post, another of their long reads, which I think is just worth commenting on. It's essentially talking about the intelligence both in the West and in Russia, and that not only led to the war but also since the war began, sort of offers a rare insight really into the activities particularly of the FSB, and argues that in many ways it bears responsibility for the failed Russian war plan. And it talks about how essentially nearly every intelligence service with a stake in the war made consequential misjudgments. Obviously, the US spy agencies underestimated, I think it's fair to say, Ukraine's ability to withstand the onslaught, and that may have contributed to their initial hesitation to send heavy and sophisticated weaponry. Obviously, Ukraine's services appeared to have read too much into signs that Russian forces were ill-prepared for a full-scale combat, resisting Western warnings of an invasion that came within miles of the capital. And of course, fundamentally, Russia's intelligence breakdowns, which seem, according to the article, more systematic due to unreliable sources and disincentives to deliver hard truths to the Kremlin, which ultimately was responsible for this catastrophic miscalculations that were in the early weeks of the war. war. And it also just, as I say, offers some interesting snippets as well. I mean, it's too long to read to summarise in full, but it talks about how on February the 8th, Macron said publicly that he'd received personal assurance from Putin that Russia would not escalate the situation. And indeed, we also understand that Germany's spy chief had said days earlier that Putin's decision on whether to attack had not yet been made. And it goes into some of the background conversations into more detail about what exactly was being said between Moscow and Paris. And it also talks as well about extensive polling conducted by the FSB that showed large segments of Ukraine's population were prepared to resist Russian encroachment. But it seems nonetheless that this was ignored and bypassed by the FSB. And indeed, it seems that this figure of 48% is being bound around that they asked this question of would you resist, any military attack? And 48% said that they would. And because this was under 50%, this may well have been significant for the decision that was eventually made. I don't know how true that is, but it talks about this potentially in the article as being a statistic of significance and a misreading of the Ukrainian resolve. So as I say, another big read by the Washington Post, and one that I would recommend listeners give it a read.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.